Humans and other warm-blooded animals have a double circulatory system. This means they have two circuits joined together with the heart at the middle. Starting from the right side of the heart is the pulmonary circuit. Blood is pumped from the right side of the heart up to the lungs, where it obtains oxygen, and then can return to the left side of the heart. The systemic circuit starts from the left side of the heart, where oxygenated blood is pumped to all the other organs around the body, and the blood supplies oxygen to these areas, such as the organs, and can then return to the heart into the right side of the heart. The heart is an organ that pumps the blood around the body and keeps it flowing. It has a particular structure with lots of different parts that you must know about. It is mostly made of muscle tissue. It is made up of 4 different chambers, the ventricles and atria. There are valves to prevent black flow, and it has its very own blood supply through the coronary arteries. So here are some important labels that you need to be able to identify on a diagram of the heart. So the vena cava, which is on the right side of the heart, the right atrium, so the chamber at the top of the heart, the tricuspid valve, so that sits between the atrium and the right ventricle, the septum, which is the tissue that separates the two sides of the heart, the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve, which you can see again sits between the ventricle and the left atrium. Blood comes into the left atrium from the pulmonary vein and leaves the left ventricle via the aorta. The pulmonary artery is where blood leaves the right ventricle and goes up to the lungs. The cardiac cycle is the order of events that occur across those different structures we just talked about every heartbeat. We're going to discuss how this occurs, and we must remember that normally the left and the right side of the hearts are beating together. So here's the heart, and we can have blood flowing in and out of the heart at the same time, and then blood moving through the heart. Now these normally occur together, but we're going to talk about them separately to be able to identify the structures. So at the start of the cardiac cycle, blood will flow into the right atrium through the vena cava, which is bringing deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body. After this, the atria will contract and the blood will be pushed from the right atrium through to the right ventricle. After atrial contraction is ventricular contraction, and this will push the blood into the pulmonary artery, so from the right ventricle out and up towards the lungs to become oxygenated. The blood will then flow from the left atrium through the pulmonary vein, bringing oxygenated blood from the lungs. Again, the atria will contract, and that will push the blood from the left atrium through to the left ventricle. And then following atrial contraction is again ventricular contraction, so the blood is then pushed from the left ventricle up through the aorta and out to the rest of the organs in the body, as it is now carrying oxygenated blood. The left ventricle wall is very thick because every time this ventricle contracts, it's got to push the blood at a very high pressure through the aorta to vessels all around the body. Heart valves make sure that the blood flows in the right direction and doesn't flow backwards, going through the heart. There are valves found between the atria and the ventricles, and the ventricles and the arteries that take the blood away from the heart. So when the atria contract, you'll notice that the valves through to the arteries are actually closed. so the blood cannot flow through them yet. And the bicuspid and tricuspid valve are open, so the blood can flow from the atria to the ventricles and in no other direction. During ventricular contraction, the opposite occurs. So the valves to the arteries, so from the ventricles to the arteries, are open, so the blood can flow out of the ventricles. And the bicuspid and tricuspid valve are closed, so the blood cannot flow backwards up from the ventricles to the atria. So the heart beats around 70 times every minute. And the heart is made up, we said, of mainly muscle tissue. So the walls themselves need to have a constant supply of oxygen if they're going to be able to contract this many times a minute. So the oxygen supplied for respiration and then to provide energy comes from the coronary arteries. So these are arteries that can be seen on the outside of the heart. Resting heart rate is controlled by a group of cells found in the atrial wall that act as a pacemaker. So to do this, these cells produce a small electric impulse which causes the surrounding cells to contract. Patients with irregular heartbeats sometimes have to be fitted with an artificial pacemaker. This is a device that is implanted into the chest and produces its own electric current, so a bit like the natural pacemaker cells, to keep the heart beating regularly.